Welcome to our next GCSE revision video. This is for OCR GCSE Psychology and it's for our psychological problems section. Now for this section we need to know two theories of depression. So we're going to have a talk today about why we might get depression and two theories that OCR would like us to know for the exam. A little bit of background first of all. We talked in the previous video about how we measure mental health and how we might diagnose somebody. So the bit that we need to take from that for our theories of depression is how we would decide what classes as depression and what just classes as a low mood. Now depression tends to be a term that we use quite regularly when we talk about our own moods. But what we're talking about here is what we call clinical depression. So this is the depression that has been diagnosed by a doctor and it meets those criteria for diagnosis that we talked about in the last video. There are three levels of depression that we can get: mild, moderate and severe, and whether you were diagnosed with each one of those would then impact on how the doctor would treat you. If we look at a definition of what depression is, then we are measuring a behaviour that, or we're measuring a patient that has a loss of interest and enjoyment, reduced energy leading to increased fatigability and diminished activity, marked tiredness after only slight effort is common. So what we're talking about is this loss of enjoyment and interest is a really kind of low mood for a long period of time. That things that perhaps you would have done before that you had enjoyment in and would make you feel happy no longer make you feel happy, to the point where you don't want to take part in them anymore. So even though you know perhaps going for a walk might make you feel better, you don't want to go for a walk, or it's really hard to motivate yourself to go for a walk. This increased fatigability means that you get tired very easy. So even if you do decide to take part in activities, then you very quickly become really tired and have to take a break. Diminished activity is just describing the fact that you might not be motivated to do anything at all, and actually what you would prefer to do was just kind of sit and do nothing, and even that in itself would be very tiresome. Now, in order to clinically diagnose depression, the doctor would use a book very similar to this one. This is called the ICD-10. Now, this is a book it lists mental health conditions, very much the same as diagnostical manuals would for physical conditions that have a list of symptoms. And for some doctors, it might just be a case of they can diagnose you straight away if it's a common problem. If it's less common, they may need to look in one of these books and bring up a list of symptoms, and then they can check off to see how your symptoms match in order to give you a diagnosis. So this is one specifically for mental health conditions, and it lists some symptoms that are common for periods of depression. And as you can see just by reading these, they are ones that we've just talked about on the last slide, but also ones that you can kind of see might fit in with somebody who's struggling with depression. So we've got things like diminished appetite, and of course that might lead to weight loss. But then we've also got things on here like reduced self-esteem and self-confidence. And what's very common in people with depression is this idea of guilt or worthlessness, where they think that people are tired of them and they're not worth anything, and they're just kind of becoming burdensome. We also have on here this disturbed sleep. Now what might happen if you've got disturbed sleep is that you feel very tired, but when you do sleep it's not restful sleep. So it's not refreshing you, it's not meaning you wake up in the morning and you're able to take on the world. You still feel incredibly tired, and it might mean that you wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, or it might mean that you wake up early in the morning and you're awake then and you can't get back to sleep then. In terms of a diagnosis, what we're after is two of these to be present for a fairly long period of time. So when a patient goes to the doctors and they are feeling unwell, the doctor will ask them several questions, and if two or more of those symptoms have been there and they've been present for 2 weeks or more, the doctor will ask some questions to try and ascertain if that's been for most of the days, whether it's been all day or whether when it has happened it's been for most of the time. And also they will find out if there's anything that may have triggered this episode. Now, it's really important to stress that depression is a normal reaction to some life-changing events. So if you have experienced grief or loss, or you've had a life-changing event like a divorce, then actually depression might be quite common. And that's not to say that it's a problem, because it might pass after a certain amount of time. What we're talking about here with clinical depression is a depression that has no real obvious cause. So it may be caused by another reason rather than something that's happening in that person's life. And that might be where the doctor diagnoses mild, moderate or severe depressive episode, and that of course has an impact then on the treatment. The key question for psychologists is why some people suffer from depression and others don't. Now, some people can have some massively life-changing events and not struggle with depression at all. And other people might have what seems on the outside a perfectly happy, normal life with no ups and downs, and they may develop depression. So for psychologists, it's about looking at the reasons why that might happen. And the two theories that we've got today are looking at perhaps the thought process that we have, whether that might lead to depression, and also then if there's something in our biology that might lead to depression. The first theory we're going to have a look at is the ABC model of depression, and this was put forward by a psychologist called Ellis in the early 1960s. Now, this is what we call a cognitive theory, so this is looking at the thought processes and specifically about how those thought processes may be faulty and how that might lead to development of depression. So our thought processes are very much like a computer, they're like a program, and they tend to happen in the same way every time. But if that program is not programmed in the right way, if there's an error in that programming, then that might lead the output, the eventual thought, to be faulty. So this particularly focuses on our irrational beliefs about the outside world. Now, in somebody without depression, the irrational thoughts or irrational beliefs would be easy to challenge, or they wouldn't happen in the first place. But with somebody with depression, these irrational beliefs might be their first thoughts, and they might be much harder to dislodge. Now, the really important thing about this model is that it has a therapy attached to it, which is a really good application point for it, because it means if this is the reason why somebody has depression, then it means that we can treat it and we can reteach the behaviour and hopefully change the thought process to be a rational thought process. This is how the model works. The A stands for activate an event. There is an event that happens, a situation in the environment that will trigger the thought. Now, as we said before, with somebody without depression, that thought might be rational or it might easily be challenged. For a person with depression, that thought process is probably going to be an irrational thought. So it's not going to be a logical thought that would automatically come from that event. The B is for belief. So this is about how that event is interpreted by the individual that leads them to that rational thought. Okay, so it's really important that we sort of get in our head that this belief, this thought that the person has is not logical, it's faulty. The consequence of that is that how the person then feels about that event or that person that's triggered that irrational belief. Now, in using the example in this way, that consequence is always going to be a depressive episode. In someone without depression, the consequence probably wouldn't be anything at all. But for how we're applying the model today, then the consequence would be depression. Let's see how that looks if we put it in an example then, so it can make a little bit more sense to you. So the activating event might be you see a friend of yours in town while you're walking around, you call out to them, call their name, but they don't answer you. Now, an irrational belief about that situation may be to start thinking about, oh my goodness, what have I done? Are they not speaking to me? Why are they ignoring me? I must have done something really bad. And of course, that consequence would be to then feel that you have a high level of guilt that this person doesn't want to be a friend anymore, and that would lead to sad and loneliness. For someone without depression, that belief is going to be a lot more rational. So the belief might be something along the lines of, oh, they didn't hear me above the traffic, or they've got their earphones in and they were listening to music so they didn't hear me. It wouldn't be automatically to jump to the irrational belief. The second theory we need to have a look at is an evolutionary theory. So the first thing we need to do is just get our head around what we mean by evolution in the psychological sense. So we're talking about the adaptation of behaviour, and particularly what we're talking about is those sorts of behaviours that we've kept hold of because they have survival value. They're what we call adaptive behaviours. They've helped us survive. And because they've helped us survive, what we mean then is we've passed these behaviours on through our genetic code to our offspring. So you can use giraffes' long necks as a really good example of this, that because giraffes have a longer neck, they're able to reach more food, and that means they're more likely to survive and have offspring, so they pass on the long neck gene to their offspring. If a giraffe has a shorter neck and there's no food that they can reach, then they won't be able to survive and have offspring and pass on those short neck genes. If we apply that to behaviours, we're talking about the behaviours that have perhaps meant we are able to survive in a social group, or we've been able to progress past other people, develop new skills, and it has survival value that way. So this is what we class as a biological theory because it's evolution, it's got that genetic link. So the way social rank theory works in terms of explaining depression is that it suggests that depression is an evolution, and it's got a function to keep us safe in society. The suggestion is here that if we try and move outside our social rank, so outside the role or the job or the class that we are in, if we try and move outside that and we fail, then an episode of depression might stop us trying to move outside that rank again. Now, the way that this works then, the way it's helpful, is that it means that society can function better with less conflict. So you don't have everybody trying to move up the social rank all at the same time. Because of course if that happened, we'd have lots of queen bees and no worker bees. For society to function, we have to have a few people at the top leading, but the majority of people much lower down the social ranks actually doing the day-to-day jobs and helping society keep on track. So this idea is that depression then keeps us from trying to move up this social rank if we're not capable of doing that, or if there's no place for us to move to. Got an example for you again so you can see how that one might look. So here's John. Let's say he's applied for a promotion at work. He's ready to take the next step. He's worked really hard, but he doesn't quite have the skills he needs to do that next step up the ladder. Now in the interview he might sort of be able to sort of put his point forward, but at the end of the day, if the company decide he hasn't got the skills, he won't get the job. So poor John gets rejected for the promotion, and this leads to him developing depression. Now what this actually does is it stops him applying for that promotion again. So it keeps him in the rank where his skills are best suited. Now there are several more different explanations of depression that we could go through. You could have a look at serotonin levels and how that might impact on depression. You can have a look at the psychodynamic explanations and how that might lead to depression from problems in childhood. But for OCR GCSE, we're just interested in these two viewpoints. Now there's nothing to say that one's better than the other. They are just viewpoints put forward by different psychologists, one looking at thought processes and one looking at biological genetic reasons for depression. Now the way that these work is you can apply them to the same situation and you can come up with different reasons. So if we have a look at this one that's on the screen now as a bit of an idea, here's a scenario about Joel trying to buy his house. He fails to buy the house in the area that he really wants to, and that leads to him having a bout of depression. Now if we were using Ellis's ABC model, we could see that the activating event is being unable to buy the house. The belief that that leads to is this idea that he'll never be good enough to buy this house or live in this area. and the consequence of that would be developing depression. We can use the social rank theory to also try and explain this as well, that to move to this really nice area, Joel is trying to move outside his rank. He's been unable to do so, and to keep him from trying again to move outside his social rank, he's developed depression. So you can use both of these ideas to explain behaviour in different ways, but the consequence of both, or the end point of both, is the development of depression. Okay, so I hope you find that useful. Don't forget, we've got other videos on schizophrenia and also about treatments.